do something completely different than what everybody else is doing. It may not get you anywhere, but I mean, to really stand out, this stuff is like it's so everybody's doing the same thing. Even though it's slightly different, a lot of it sounds the same.
So today is Thursday, August 8th, 2024. Who are we speaking with?
Tommy Musto.
Tell us about your early days as a DJ in Brooklyn and how did you get first into the music scene?
So, as a youngster, I loved music, obviously. Um, my family was into music, not professionally, and had records and stuff like that, and started buying records, but not certainly when I was younger, not the music that we know today, or the style of music, um, pop records, 45s, and things like that. And then I eventually wanted to do something else, so I bought a guitar with paper route money, and I said, "Damn, this is pretty hard." So I never really picked up the guitar after that. I messed with it a little bit, but at that time, someone who worked for my father was a DJ, and I saw what he was doing. He took me to his house. I remember he had some 1100 turntables and a club and mixer, and it was probably I guess late 76. Well, actually, no, it was probably more late 75, early 76. So I was kind of young, obviously, at the time, maybe 13 or something like that. And I got the bug because I saw that how I can be involved in the music a little more than just listening without having to, learn an instrument. Um, and then not too soon after that, I bought a set of turntables, terrible ones, of course. Um, and I remember it might have been a realistic mixer. Realistic was like one of the first ones that I ever saw that was
Mhm.
a DJ mixer and started buying records. I guess late 76, 77. And from there, started DJing local parties, became a known DJ in the area. Um, from there, I went to college, and in college, I wound up working for the radio station. I was a broadcasting major, and from there, I got into a record pool, which was fantastic. It was an intermetro record pool. Dwayne Dixon was the curator at that particular time, um, and uh, I wound up meeting a lot of people who wound up blowing up. Um, if I remember correctly, Junior Vasquez was in that pool as well at that time.
Wow.
Um, but what happened was Carlos De Jesus had came down to the record pool and was asking, looking for people to do mixes for KTU. And my partner at the time, Tommy Sozi, and I, we made a cassette for him, and we wound up winning out of everybody in the pool. And from that started doing the mix show for KTU. And that obviously opened up a whole nother world of things. Um, just being, well known in a much larger area than my local area, of being on New York radio. And then I started getting record labels calling and, giving us promos. The whole thing about especially DJing, especially back then, was having stuff that no one else had. I mean, it's still the case, at nauseum for that matter. But at that time, getting promos early and stuff like that really differentiated you. And labels obviously wanted us to play the records on the radio, and we started doing that. And then from that, started wanting to get more involved in music and production, and the easiest thing to do for that was editing. So we started editing and edited a few records from there. This is probably maybe 81 around that time. And then eventually started buying some pieces of gear, a Roland 808. Yeah, I remember Yamaha DX7, and we had a Tascam 4 track, and we started messing around with that. And then From that, we started doing some productions and remixes on a very small level. And eventually, my partner couldn't deal with all the nonsense in the business. He wanted some more gratification and money, and the business is not like that. And I was much more patient, so I stuck with it, and he wound up doing something else. He passed away eventually, unfortunately. May he rest in peace. But I had great memories with him. But I continued on from there, and then I happened to meet. I changed record pools. I joined the Shore Record Pool in the Bronx. Bobby Davis, another person who was invaluable to me. He was awesome, great cheerleader, great teacher. Um, he was friends with my old partner, who also passed away, Silvio Tancredi. Um, Bobby Davis had remixed the BB Girls. It was on 25 West Records for the same man. And a few other records on the label Bobby was involved with. And Bobby had introduced us to Silvio, and then we wound up remixing the follow-up single to the BB Girls. It was called Jungle Swing. And I just kind of hit it off with Silvio, and Tommy Sozi at the time tried to go in the other direction, and I stuck with it. And Silvio and I became very good friends, and I became a more integral part of the company, just being there and doing things. And then at one time there was a guy, Alan Shivik, who was really known, not being the nicest guy and not being straight up. He had his equipment at the studio at 25 West 38th Street, where Fourth Floor was. And one day, Silvio had got there, and all the equipment was gone. The guy just took off. So he had asked me, "Do you have equipment home?" And I did. I had some stuff, and I brought my equipment there, and that was the beginning of my involvement with Northcott Productions at the time. It was probably 84, 85. And eventually we became legal partners, probably around 86. Um, and at that time, we started fourth. Actually, he started Fourth Floor Records. He had started that, and then I came along. So it was really a culmination of things after that. Some interesting tidbits on that same floor was an importer of records, Chico Productions, and Chico Productions rented the front part of the loft on 25 West 38th, and probably the biggest records for him was Casso Key West that he had Jelly Bean edit. He had imported that record that was a huge record, obviously, um, and many other records that were very big. One record that I happened to use it as the bed of a remix for Tommy Sozi and I was Dance Forever by Gaucho. Was a big import. Some other ones were Jago, I'm Going to Go, which was a very big Frankie Knuckles record. So he was an importer, and I'm kind of jumping around a little bit because it's a lot to remember and kind of regurgitate to you in a concise form. Um, and I guess at that point, Chico had wound up moving out, and New Groove came in. Frank Mendez and Silvio were friends from very early on, and Frank was big in the distribution world, and he wanted to start a label, and he started New Groove with his wife and Judy Russell, who used to work at Vinyl Mania. So it was very cool. We had Suburban Fourth Floor, and no, actually, Suburban wasn't even around then. I shouldn't even say Suburban. It wasn't. It was just Fourth Floor and various other labels that we had, and New Groove was in the front. So it was a great collective of energy and people coming through. And as you can obviously know by the output of these labels, the Burrell Brothers, it was great. It was definitely a great time. And then at that point, we had left 25 West 38th. Something happened with the landlord. I think he sold the building, if I remember correctly, and we had to move out. So at that time, we had an office in Uptown Manhattan. It was just an office space, and the studio wound up going to my house where I was living in Staten Island at the time. and that was probably, I want to say, late 80s, early 90s. And that's when I started doing a bunch of remixes. So it was, I had just gotten married. At the time, I was doing remixes for major labels, which was a great time in my life. So I was remixing all those major label records and doing a lot of the recording and the tracking in my house, which was great. Um, people would walk in and they'd hear, Michael Jackson singing and be like, "What the hell is he doing down there?" And then from there, I mean, I'm kind of condensing all of this. We got the studio on 594 Broadway where we met. And at that moment, we actually started SubUrban while I was still living in Staten Island. It was probably 92, 93, if I remember correctly. And the first bunch of records I did with Victor Simonelli, who I was also tight with throughout the whole beginning of my career, myself, him, Frankie Bones, Lenny D, um, a whole bunch of people. The records speak for themselves. Um, and from there, we wound up creating this collective of other labels. So not only doing our own labels, but distributing, God, maybe 10 or 12 others from Roy Davis Jr., the Basement Boys, Sulfuric, Henry Street. Um, so it was a great time for us. And towards the end, Assume Day, which was awesome, obviously, for Yoruba Records. And there were others, and forgive me if I leave some of them out. Um, but that was a great time, and that lasted till, like, 2000, 2001, and then September 11th happened. Um, the business was changing drastically, people were sharing files like crazy, so to be a distributor was becoming much more difficult and not worth it, and God, at that point, I remember I was living in Massapequa at the time on Long Island. We moved the studio out there, put a lot of other stuff in storage, and by 2002, we had closed the company, and I had changed careers, and Silvio had changed careers. I went into finance, and Silvio went into insurance. I'm still in finance today. I can't even believe it. It seems like a lifetime already. From 2002 until 2024 is 22 years. Um, so for a long time after that, I was pretty, I don't want to say angry, but when something's in your fabric and it is everything to you and, you can't do it for a living and make money at it, I was not angry, but bitter would be the word I would say. And I don't even want to hear a 4/4 kick for quite a few years, till about maybe 2005. And then I started getting the bug again. I started, downloading files and listening to what was going on and noticed that things really weren't changed that much from when I left. And for that matter, even today, they haven't changed that much. Um, Probably the biggest thing that's changed from when I left was more of the Afro sound. A lot of, the soulful house is still there. Tracks are still being made. These disco kind of new disco records, they're more production based and more developed now, which is great. But it's really wild how things haven't changed that much. Um, so getting to today, I'm actually, I guess for lack of a better term, I'm a financial advisor. No one would ever think that, I had this creative side and a business side, but I was always partners with Sylvia, and we always discussed business, although he dealt with the business daily and I dealt with the creative side. Um, but it was very tough. It took many, many years to develop a business and have a business that sustained myself. Um, but it's nice not having to kind of worry about money and figure out what records am I going to put out and find a producer and put up the money and why isn't this selling, and so that whole part of making music now, which we'll get into, I started doing it again. It kind of freed me from having to worry about the money side, and I feel for a lot of people doing it because um, if it's all you want to do and know how to do, it's a tough game right now. And for me doing it, it's just an outlet of having fun and experimenting and slowly getting my chops back, so to speak. I had to learn, software again, and things are done very differently now for the most part. And so I'm kind of doing both, making music and learning, and you always learn no matter what. I love learning, and I love the whole aspect of technology and production and stuff like that. It was always a thing of mine, and engineering. Um, so that's kind of where I am right now. Slowly but surely, I've been doing things. I'm sure you may have seen. I've done some work for some people over throughout the years, in the recent years. Let's see what else. Defected has finally, they own my catalogs of Suburban and Fourth Floor, and many other people's catalogs for that matter. And they finally started seriously putting out the masters with remixes, which is great. Um, I don't have any involvement in that from an A&R standpoint or direction. I certainly wanted to and like to, but they chose for me not to. Don't want to get too political and mention names and do all that. So I don't really have any part in that, and I have to say I'm thankful the fact that they're doing it because records were good, some of them very influential, and it's nice to see them come out again. And the ones that they have done thus far has been some great remixes. Um, myself throughout the years having relationships, I probably would have um, liked some other people to do remixes that are more integral to the scene rather than kind of trying to cross them over, so to speak. Um, but facing the facts, the British and European scene is really the only game in town where you can make money selling records. So I understand that standpoint from them. Um, but it's definitely a shame. It's a shame that there are so many talented people right now and so many records that I love, and I still, up on new music. I download and of course playing here and there now. But it's a tough game for people, man. I don't know how they do it. Like I said, I don't have to worry about the money part of it. I don't want to sound like an ass, but I just started another life for myself, and I'm doing this now for fun rather than for a living. And it's a tough game, man. There's so many records coming out. There's splinters of genres. There's a ton of DJs and a lot of good ones. Not enough places to play. Um, Things being very clicky, and um, people that are in a position of power to help others and lift them up still is not happening, which I think is really sad. Um, no one wants to, take the spotlight off them. I don't know, maybe it's easy for me to say now, but I think that that's what moves the game forward, and just lifting people up that need a chance. There's so many good people, and what really kind of leveled the playing field a little bit was COVID, right? Everybody had the same audience opportunity with Twitch and stuff like that. So that was cool, and it kind of made that a little bit more consistent and viable for people. But let's face it, everybody wants to be in front of a crowd of people. That's the only enjoyment or the real enjoyment from doing what we do. So, I mean, that's kind of sad. I mean, me personally, I hate being stared at when I'm playing. I don't like cameras on me. I'm not a Twitch guy. I mean, for me, I give it to people like, Joe or Louie that can kind of put on this show while they're DJing, but the average person really shouldn't or can't. It becomes like contrived or forced. And look, seriously, when a DJ is mixing and he's queuing up the next record, well, scrolling through files, how exciting is that? It's not something that I find people need to watch. So I was never really a big fan of that. So I don't know, maybe I'm just old school, but a lot of people like it now because it's the only exposure they have, and I understand that. I don't fault them for it, and there'll be times when I will do it and have done it, but it's not necessarily my thing. Maybe I could shut up for 5 minutes and you can ask me a question.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
More of that, more of that, more of
Oh,
that. Um, who were your biggest influences during your early career, and how did their music shape your sound?
um, okay, when you say that, do you mean other producers or producers as far as, like, I don't know,
Both, both.
both. So, a lot of where I come from in my head and musically is what I grew up listening to, the whole Philly sound, even before it became disco and when it was more R&B oriented, I loved all of that, and didn't even realize what it was or what it really turned into being, but things like, all of the Philly stuff and things like that, that were really a derivative of that, um, is kind of ingrained in me. I love like Earl Young's drums and, Harris Baker Young, that whole rhythm section. That's kind of like the foundation of what everybody does for that matter. All the early house records, um, are really based on kind of that vibe, even though they were crude and electronic, they were based on that vibe, and I think that not until the '90s, when people started using live bass and started doing some, hiring keyboard players and stuff like that, it got more developed and closer to that. But certainly that was an influence for me, and I have to thank my older brothers, who were buying, James Brown or Barry White and, all of those things. Um, in the early '70s before I even realized what I liked, you know? Um, so that was definitely an influence, and then, um, people who influenced me to the point where I started actually making productions were, people like, uh, Shep Pettibone, Jelly Bean, um, and more when I say those guys in particular, they were DJs transitioned to production, so I saw that as an avenue for myself, obviously. Um, so that was definitely something, and this whole Chicago thing kind of opened up a door to channel house music, whether it was Boy Jarvis created it, which of course I loved and listened to, and all those early Prelude records, and specifically the music got me, and then simultaneously the things happening from Chicago, it kind of opened up the door for a lot of people who were DJs trying to be producers, who were crude producers and musicians. We had some gear and we made some tracks, and some of them, became hits, in our field, in the underground world, and then some of them even larger than that. But it opened up the possibility that you didn't have to be a Reef Martin or, somebody of this big producer stature where you can actually make a record. And, you know, it got to the point where I believed in the integrity of music and the the starry-eyed way I would think of these producers that I just mentioned, like I said, like somebody like a Reef Martin or something like that, or artists. So I always felt funny that I would call myself an artist. Like when we did the Musto and Bones things, I hated to be called an artist because we weren't really singing, obviously, or anything. There were CNC Music Factory was successful at it, and there were a lot of producer things. I just felt like we were kind of stealing from integrity, so to speak, in doing that. But that's just me, and to the point where I probably hurt myself in some situations. But Um, that really, those are the really kind of things that influenced me. Um, and I just started self-teaching myself how to play, to the program, engineer, because no one was giving opportunities to anyone. So that enabled someone to come out of nowhere, even though I didn't have, back in the day, to make a disco record used to cost like $300,000. You'd have to hire an orchestra and everyone playing live, arranger. It just was, ridiculously expensive. This enabled a novice to come in and do some facsimile of that, and have something that's viable. And that's essentially what wound up happening. Making these crude records, and from there growing into, okay, we got to do some vocal records, we got to start getting into things like that. I always had an ear for pitch, and I thought I was always good at coaching vocalists. I'll say I was and am good at coaching vocalists, because not that I could sing that great, but I know what I want to hear, and I know music enough to do that. um, that was a differentiating talent for me, because even though I dealt with some great singers, a lot of them weren't very educated in a sense musically. So they can sing well, but to put together a bunch of ad libs and where to place them, it was kind of crude. I kind of felt, me being this white boy telling this, gorgeous black woman where to put ad libs, and she's singing so great. It's kind of weird to do, but and I think of I don't want to name names, but I think of a few people that come to the top of my head that sang great but needed some help with placement, and thinking some riff ideas and stuff like that. It was early on. One of those people was definitely not Barbara Tucker, who I mentioned. She was one of the first vocalists that I got a chance to work with. She was being managed by this guy, Glenn Toby. He goes back a way back. And I forgot how I met her. But at the time, Peter Dow was working for me, and how he started working for me. And I know I'm going backwards now. I was doing all the records for Fourth Floor and New Groove. I was engineering everything. I was pulling my hair out. Um, and at that time, Bobby Conda started making records for them, and I wish I would have did the poem, but I didn't. But I did some others with Bobby. But what happened was Peter Dow was Silvio's best friend's brother-in-law, so we needed some help, and he was a trained pianist, and he's a very smart guy anyway. He came in, and I kind of taught him how to engineer, and he's very smart, and he grasped it pretty quickly, and he started taking over my sessions, which was great. So I had some time to myself, and then that grew into other things, and then Barbara Tucker. We wound up meeting Barbara Tucker, and I did Barbara Tucker. She actually sang the demo to Colorblind, Nothing Better, but for some reason we couldn't come to an agreement um, on a contract. I think Glenn, she was fine, and it was Glenn Toby who was a little tough as a manager, so it never wound up happening. That probably would have said a whole bunch of things differently for me and Barbara. And what wound up happening, she met Louis, and then that took off, and rightfully so, because Barbara's tremendously talented. Obviously, Louis tremendously talented, and a whole direction happened to her career, which is, it's in the history books at this point. But it's the point I was trying to make, that I didn't want anyone to think that Barbara was somebody who I needed to tell riffs to, because the second she opened her mouth back then, I was like, oh shit, this is like my first chance to actually work with somebody who could literally sing, so that was good. Um, and then Peter Dow, I remember he was doing sessions. He got so good, he was doing sessions, and I think I introduced him to Danny Tenaglia, and then Danny started using him, and they started making records together, and then everybody parted different ways. There was so many tentacles that happened from Northcott with so many different people. I mean, I'm very fortunate to have, if not relationships, at least, having able to work with so many different people throughout the history of the company that came through that door, it was great. It was definitely great. I'll never forget that. Maybe I need.
How did winning? Oh yeah, it's all good. How did winning the Tommy Boy's record mix contest in 1981 impact your career?
Well, that was definitely something big. How that happened was, at that time, I was working at local clubs uh, in Brooklyn, and Ralphie D, who was he was the DJ at 2001 Odyssey, and Tommy Sozi and I, when we just started out, we actually were like going around to see what clubs were like. We must have been 16 or whatever. We got into the Odyssey, and we used to go listen to Ralphie play, and listen to him mix and say, "Oh wow," kind of learn, obviously. Um, and we became friends after that. And I think Ralphie saw an opportunity in us to kind of get him into the production side, and we saw in him an opportunity to help us on the club side, which worked out just like that in the end. But in the end, he had made us aware of the contest. We didn't know about the contest. He heard about it before us, so he came and asked us if we would do it with him, and that's what we did. We actually did it in my bedroom when I was living in Brooklyn, on a 4-track and a 2-track. I had the 4-track Tascam and the Techniques 1500, the one with the loop on it, the reel to reel. I wish I still had that thing, but I don't. Um, and we made the mix, and we won the contest. I couldn't believe it because there was so many talented people. And one that comes to head is Aldo Marin, who I became friends with from Shore Record Pool before all that. Um, and we wound up winning. It was definitely a great moment. It was definitely a proud moment because at that time, Tommy Boy was it. You're talking about, I mean, internationally known, the records crazy, Arthur Baker, John Roby, just insane, and it definitely was something that we were proud of. It gave us the opportunity to go to do it in the studio. So we didn't mimic what we did, but somewhat, using all the master tapes, which was one of the prizes to do that. So we wound up doing that. It was in Tom Silverman's house, which was great. And one of the bedrooms was a little studio with a synclavier and a tape machine. The engineer happened to be Doug DeFranco, which was Double D and Steinsky, who were two remixers that did some awesome mashups. I guess what we call the mashups today, that were really, really popular. They're radio. It turns out that he was first cousins with the person that I was mentioning before that showed me his turntables and worked for my father. Blew my mind. I mean, it was like crazy. By the way, that person, his name was Donald DeFranco, and he passed away on September 2001, September 11th. He was the head transmitter technician for WABC TV. So he was at the top of the building. And this is a person that worked on, my father had a television repair business. And all throughout my childhood, I was around, solder and transistors and televisions and stereos. And I actually eventually installed car radios. That's what happened as a young kid. And he was one of the bench techs. And, I always used to bother him. I was the annoying kid in the store, and he saw that I had a liking for music, and it just kind of developed from there. And it was definitely amazing that he wound up being first cousins with Doug from Double D and Seinsky. It was definitely ironic. So that happened. A record came out. It helped a lot, obviously. Um, we definitely got mixes from that and got some notoriety, and not too long after that, Tommy we wound up splitting up, not because we had a fight or anything, it's just that I was willing to sacrifice it all, and he wasn't willing to do that. And I respect that because I understand, because at some point I cut the cord too in 2001, as far as, using music as my means of making money. Um, but yeah, so from that, it definitely was an amazing thing I mean, to be sitting there in the guy's house that owns the label with the master tapes, and it was just amazing. And I don't know if you've ever seen a synclavier. It's an earlier version of sampling, way ahead of its time. It was just absolutely awesome. So seeing that early on made me hungry for the whole technology thing too. Samplers were so crude compared to that. It was really amazing. It's definitely amazing.
You were one of the first DJs to achieve international acclaim. What do you think contributed to your early success?
Well, there were certainly others for sure. I know that, so I don't want to say that I was the first, because I definitely wasn't. But one of the first wave. I think that it was the records. It was the early records, Fourth Floor, and the other records that we were doing on the offshoot labels, whether it was New Groove at that time, because really all the first records of New Groove were all of my consortium of DJs and producers, and then it expanded from that. Um, the probably the most popular of all and biggest selling New Groove records was Looney Tunes, Just As Long As I Got You. Um, and but it was definitely the records. The English were, God, when it comes to music, man, yeah, you can't take anything away from them. Aside from creating things, Beatles and everything else that goes with that, they were able to absorb the new stuff and realize what it was and its potential and blow the shit up. I mean, going there and seeing how into what we were doing and the knowledge they had of what we were doing just completely blew me away. Radio stations. I mean, I remember one of the first things we did was, if I'm not mistaken, we were on radio with Right Said Fred. You remember, I'm too sexy for so here we are with this huge pop act, and Frankie and I were other guests on the show. It was just insane, and it really, I mean, that first tour in 80, it was late 88, 89. We got there and we went up and down. We went all the way up to Scotland, back down to London, and went back up, and it was crazy driving hours on end, going to this rave, going to this club. It was I will never forget that experience because I've never experienced it anywhere else in the world, aside from maybe that place in Germany, the Funky Chicken. Remember the walls were just dripping sweat. It was I can't tell you, I first witnessed that in England, in these just unlikely places. Those I just the records were so the humidity. You'd have to wipe off records or even do it while it's playing because it was crazy. And the excitement, it was really good. The only place that I could say that I kind of felt that way was Mike Clark took me to go see Theo Parrish. And it was like, one light in the corner of the room, and I mean, that was a great that was a great party. But that whole environment, and then, of course, the raves, getting up on stage, and there's like you're in a field, and there's, merry-go-rounds and tents and all this shit going on, and just thousands of people, and they're like, "Are these people actually here to listen to me play records?" I mean, it's crazy. It was definitely insane. Um, but I think that the whole and today, really DJs are making more money DJing and using records as, you know, their calling card, which is really sad. Not that I'm devaluing DJing, but the art of making a record and putting your soul on a recording and accomplishing that is monumental. I mean, to make something out of nothing, to me, is a major, major feat for anybody, whoever does it, whether it's, you know, we consider it a bad record, a good record, but to put your heart and soul and something that came from your mind down on, not on paper, but, you know, recording it and have it there and expose yourself emotionally to the world and give that to them and say, you know, some people are going to hate it, some people are going to like it. It's a very tough thing to do. It was always for me, because, you know, everybody, no matter what you do in this life, everyone wants to be is accepted and appreciated, right? We won't even say love. Obviously, love is great, and we all want that, but just to be accepted and appreciated by someone, you know. And every time I know I made a record and put it out there, it was just like, please God, let somebody like it, you know. And there's sometimes you put them out and they're terrible, and you get over it. And sometimes you're really proud and it winds up hitting it, and you feel, you know, accomplished. Um, but in a nutshell, it was definitely the records that generated the interest to come over to England and the licensing of them. Great story was like how I met Dave Lee. I didn't know Dave from anything, and he was at Republic Records, and he was young at doing it too at that moment, but he had huge foresight. The fax machine was in the studio, and we'd be working, smoking pot, laughing, drinking, going crazy, making records. All of a sudden, fax comes through. This is Dave Lee from Republic Records. You know, we want to license Arnold Jarvis. Take some time out. We're like, oh shit, you know. Things like that, and my earlier Underworld records that I did were big licensing. Got licensed a lot. Um, I was going to make another point. Was Dave Lee? I mean, I know Dave. It's got to be since 85, 86. He's still out there killing it. I mean, he found the niche for himself by doing remixes, getting major labels to give masters like Dimitri and stuff like that, which is all great. I mean, I love that stuff.
Fourth Floor, Suburban,
Mm.
New Groove, all these different labels. What was how would you decide what you're going to put out on Fourth Floor versus Suburban? How were they similar? How were they different?
All right.
What was the vision between the two labels?
So essentially, what wound up happening was, like any business, you have to make money, and Strictly Rhythm guilty of this too. They We would have to, you know, we had overhead, we had a loft, we had employees, we had pressing bills. You have to put out music to keep the ball rolling. And some of the music is just and you put it out just for the hell of it because you need to do it. And some of it's great. What winds up happening is you kind of bastardize the label a little bit. And I'm being very frank. Like Strictly, great label. They put out awesome records. Um, they far surpassed us. I'll even say that because it's the truth. Um, but they put out a lot of garbage too. It was just a machine, and it bastardized the label. They started doing these other imprints, which kind of helped get away from that. But for me, what I didn't want to do, I wanted to do something new and something different, and not have the past affect it. So I always wanted to do vocal records. I always wanted to do things that were more embellished and not samples and stuff like that. So that's how Suburban was born. I happened to be close with Victor at the time, and I did some records on my own. He did some records on his own. We did some together, but that was the beginning of Suburban. I remember like thinking of what to name of it, and I like urban music, you know, R&B and stuff like that. Sub being under, so you know, underground, and I'll never forget um, Suburban Soul. No, I'm sorry, Urban Soul. I forget his name, God forgive me. Um, the producer, Urban Soul. I'm embarrassed that I don't know who it is, but he was very angry that I used that I put out the first record I put out was SubUrban Soul. It was Do My Thing.
Roland Clark.
Yeah, Roland Clark. Yeah, Roland, please forgive me. I'm sorry. Um, he was not happy about that, and I was sad about that because I don't like creating enemies. But I didn't even think of that. It was the label was Suburban, and Suburban Soul. I didn't realize Urban Soul. So whatever. So hopefully he forgives me now. That's all over with. But what happened with that was my ex-wife was working in Macy's at the cosmetic counter, and guess who she meets there? Oh, I met this girl at work. She's a singer. Maybe you should meet her. I said, what's her name? She says, Joy Cardwell. I was like, what? You mean right here? I happened to live in Staten Island at the time. She said, yeah. So I went to go meet her. And of course, Little Lewis um, was already out at that time. Yeah, it already happened. The album was out. Um, I don't think they had a meeting of the minds after that happened, to say the least. And Joy's a doll. Love her. She's very sweet, very talented. Um, and she wanted to do some other things. So for me, it was a layup. It was like a gift from God to have her do that. I couldn't use her name. Well, she didn't want me to use her name. I forgot. I said, I don't care. They're gonna know your voice. It's fine. And I understand it's not something that's so developed that you'd want to commit your name to it. I was cool with that. So we did that, and then um, just so happened at that time, the label that owned the Musto and Bones, which was, I want to bring this up, Tim Palmer, who owned XL City Beat. Guy, he was a visionary. He had the funding of Beggar's Banquet, which is a very big company. It's been around a very long time. The Stones and therefore. Um, but Tim was a visionary. For instance, um, Tim had the Prodigy, had the foresight that they signed the Prodigy. He also hired Richard Russell to A&R the label, who then went on to bring us Adele, right? Some other people, Nick Hawks, who had Positiva. I'm still friends with Nick, another visionary. I mean, we were all young at that time. We were going to raves together, and they were like our tour managers. Nick was like my tour manager. And, we didn't take each other seriously. And I knew he was talented, but boy, did he really hit some home runs, So that whole um, cache of people um, was definitely responsible for a lot that Frankie and I and me afterward. But Tim wanted to do an album with me, and I created this concept, Colorblind, and one of the records was Nothing Better. I happened to actually, that was Barbara Tucker sang the demo. I couldn't have her do that. So then I found this other girl to do it, this girl, Dina Roach. She sang, but I also had Joy Cardwell sing 3 or 4 of the songs off the album, and she sang a cover of "You're Gonna Make Me Love Somebody Else," which came out. But at that time, Tim, I believe his deal with the label was a little coming off, or something was wrong, and things just didn't materialize the way they should have. So the album never even came out. Um, so eventually, I have those demos. Maybe I'll do something with them. We'll see what happens. But yeah, so I guess the question you were asking me was how did I differentiate between the two labels? So I kind of went off on a tangent from there. But yeah, that was the reason. I wanted Suburban to be more developed record, soulful, musical. You know, I what's scary for me. and I have to admit, when I was making records with Frankie Bones early on, we were sampling everything a la Todd Terry and, not caring about copyright, and then everybody started doing it, and I said to myself, "Do I wanna be known for this? Is it really gonna, you know, put me in the history books and take me to the next level?" And I kinda poo-pooed it, to be quite honest. But you know what? I was wrong. Why was I wrong? Because Todd, who was making great records, those records were phenomenal. We put some of them out. Black Riot, Dum Dum Cry, All Right. That was Masters at Work. It's a whole nother story. Um, but Todd, it just, I mean, and deservedly so, Todd is God. He definitely took that shit to the next level. And, and it was from making these sample records. So me not wanting, like, a lot of the records, I would say, "Frankie, no, you take the credit. I don't wanna be on this. I'll just be the engineer or whatever. You can be the producer," because I just felt like I was bastardizing myself, not knowing that throughout history, these things became very credible, and probably the biggest recognition of that is Henry Street. We did Henry Street with Johnny D, and their whole mantra were these disco sample records, and my man took that shit to the next level, hit after Armand, Kenny Dope, I mean, hit after hit, Sneak. I mean, he really, perfected that genre and took that shit to the next level, and I guess maybe I probably said to myself, "Boy, was I wrong," because people took this shit seriously. Well, you had to pay. At that time, people were really coming after you for samples and copyright and stuff like that. But it's still these labels, Defected, Positiva, FFRR, they were paying for these records a lot of money. So I was definitely wrong from that standpoint. That I thought that I was sacrificing my integrity. Um, Here we are. But talking about Henry Street, I mean, that happened on a handshake. One night, um, I had met John. I forgot how. Maybe I went up to Sin, who he was doing promotion for Vince Pellegrino and Tony Monti and everybody up there. And I'll go up there, and I met Johnny. We kind of hit it off because he's real Brooklynite. You could tell I'm from Brooklyn. We hit it off, and I mean, he was friends with everybody, and I got to be friends with this guy, you know. Um, and he had relationships at that time. They were just budding, but he was best friends with Kenny. Obviously, Kenny and Louie were best friends, Todd. So it was around a circle of people. As a label owner, shit, I want to be around these people. They're talented, famous, and I'd like to be associated with them. That was my first thought, but we became really, really tight friends. We're still really tight friends. But the point I'm trying to make was Henry Street, um, Kenny's biggest record, the Bucketheads. I mean, to this day. I mean, I can't even see a record like that or anything else getting to that level. Like, records come out today, a producer, you want to have a hit record worldwide and make money doing what you love. None of these records get to that level. I'm using that as an example, but and there's some great records that I love that, all these producers are making that have the ability to kinda cross over, but everything's just so disposable. It's terrible. I happen to have Track Source up right now on my other monitor, and I'm looking and I could pick something out and today it's number 6, next week it's number 40, next week it's gone. Now, DJs may still play it. Obviously, you need records to play, but things are just so disposable. Um, it's a terrible thing because, like I said before, when you make these things, you're putting yourself out there, your heart, your soul, your blood, and to have it be so disposable is really discouraging. So I feel for guys doing it and need to do it. Um, as a source of their enjoyment and to make money. Somebody who I recently became very tight with was Izel. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a producer from DR. He's done records with Ronna Ray. He's done a ton of remixes. He's very popular in the underground scene. Um, he had asked me to remix one of the records off his album, and I was like, "Wow, this young kid is asking me, this old timer, to get involved and remix for him." I was very surprised that he wanted me to do that, and I was happy that he thought enough of me to include me, with all these other remixers doing these records. Michelle Cheravani, DJ Fudge, and Booker T. Even though Booker T's kind of a little bit younger than me, probably, but these are people who are in the scene, and he included me in that. So I was very happy about that. So me and him have had some great conversations. But he plays keyboards, he plays bass, he plays some guitar, he engineers. He's obviously a producer, and I saw a little of myself in him, like trying to do all of this. And he also does some great marketing um, with social media. So the reason why I bring him up is because today you have to be the man at everything. Not everybody is David Morales or Louis or Danny Teneglia, who have a team of people helping them doing all this stuff. It's a major effort, man. I mean, just, you know, one day you're looking for new drum sounds or looking for some keyboard sounds or, you know, answering emails about a licensing deal, trying to curate a new artist, or, I got to post some social media stuff. It's like, oh my God, I don't know how it's done. And to see someone do it at the level that I was able to see what he does, I was really impressed. And I'm sure he's not the only one who's doing that. Obviously, everybody's doing it. Someone who else comes to mind, like Grant Nelson, who I know for a really long time. He's hysterical. He makes hysterical social media posts because he knows that game and he's not shy, and makes great records too. So, you know, to be successful today or just be able to survive, you have to be, a musician, an engineer, a producer, a social media guy. You have to know maybe some coding. It's crazy. It's like if you said to someone, "Oh, I want to get in this business," and you say, "Are you sure you want to do this?" It's crazy. Spotify, another thing that just came to my head. I met somebody in a restaurant the other day, came up to me because I was having dinner with Johnny D and he saw Henry Street and he's like, "Oh, you got to be," and he's telling us how he's got all these views, listeners on Spotify, and he's not making any money. I'm like, join the club. You got, major artists not making money, and it's insane. So I don't know where this goes for people. We used to, I forgot who I just saw. I think he was an engineer, and he talked about when we were kids. Oh, and it was Laurent Garnier, who is phenomenal, all around producer. He's actually very funny from what I've seen. Um, he is some of the foundation of this whole scene, no question. Um, I believe it was him. I'm 100%. I'm not 100% sure, but he was talking about how we used to get records. This is before the scene, or we were kids, and go over someone's house and who had the better stereo. And you used to listen to the records and talk about the music and do all these things and look at the cover and turn it around. And it was tangible, you know. And that's how we kind of learned about things, about history, who were the producers, who were the musicians, learned about sound and things like that. And then from there, it became CDs, and it became a little bit more disposable, and it became a little bit more like a novelty because you had the record. Well, you got to get the CD too. And then from CDs, it went to digital files, and then LimeWire came out, and Napster, and it became like the people who were creating this stuff were just getting screwed left and right. From this level all the way up to Prince, who said, "Screw you, Warner Brothers. I'm doing this shit myself." So, it wasn't just, it was everybody. So, I guess the theme, that I'm trying to say is that it's tough for people these days, and to do it for the love of it and make good records and not know what the outcome is gonna be, people just appreciating it and jocking it is all you can really give them. I mean, don't download it, don't give it to me for free, don't share it with people, go and buy the down that's what I would say. Anytime you can buy something of someone's, buy it. And I do it today, to this day. Always do it. I have no problem. I'm not saying I don't get things for free, because I do, and thankfully I have relationships like everyone else all around the world, and we're sharing some things, but not really new music. Remixes that are done, someone did on Bandcamp or something like that. Which is Bandcamp is a whole nother story. Are you familiar with any of that stuff? It's like copyright is completely bastardized. Anyone could do anything right now, and it doesn't really matter. And if that shows you the value is demoralized, the labels and the copyright owners aren't even going after people because it doesn't mean anything. Did I depress you enough?
No, it's fine. It's good. This is this is keeping it real.
Yeah.
Um, um, how did you how, how did you discover and develop new talent during the early days of your label?
Um, Networking, relationships, other musicians, you just develop a natural network of people. I mean, for me, and I'm sure everyone else, you spent time in the studio and then you went out to clubs. I remember, especially during the days of when Northcott was at 594 Broadway, I was never home. This was kind of ended my marriage, but I'd be in the studio all day. Right, I'd get there at, I don't know, 10 in the morning, work until, midnight, go to Sound Factory bar, let's say, until 3, 4 in the morning, and network and do stuff like that, get home at whatever, 4 or 5, sleep a few hours, drive back to the city and do it all over again. Um, but that was it, just networking. Definitely, I would say musicians were a big part of the whole piecing the puzzle together to find new talent. Because who was it? Let's say a guy was a guitarist and he was in on a session for a commercial and he met this girl who, had to sing some Twinkies commercial. I don't know, make something up. And no, I have somebody who's really good. That was one. And just popped into my head. Another big source of talent for me was Lee Genesis. Lee Genesis was friends with Silvio early on. They know each other since the late 70s, early 80s. And Lee was a church singer. And I used to do sessions with Lee as lead vocalist, and he'd bring in his girls. And that's how I met Yolanda Wins, Kathleen Murphy, who sang Breakaway. Yolanda Wins obviously did the Chaka Khan cover I did. Um, Sabrina Johnston, I met through Kenny Johnston, who was good friends with uh, Drew Sadler, who was a backup musician for Slave, but he was also friends with Silvio Tancredi, my old partner. So a lot of this late 70s stuff. I mean, there was so much stuff that happened with Silvio and Northcott prior to me coming there. I mean, um, Sturkin and Rogers, who were writers, used to come and do their demos there. Um, God, there's so many. The System, right? The System. Um, uh, he did a record for 25 West called Sass, not much too much. So that was something, and there was so many other things that happened during that. I just can't remember all of them at one time. Um, but that Lee Genesis was definitely a part of that wave of singers that I got to use. And I still speak to Yolanda Wins. Yolanda Wins is actually a music teacher, um, forgive me, I can't remember the name of the school right now, but she's high up there and well regarded. I'm very happy with her. I'm sure she gets a lot of enjoyment out of doing what she's doing, teaching these kids. And I don't mean like little kids. I mean, maybe teenagers and young adults.
Few more questions on the music and production side.
Okay.
Your collaboration with Frankie Bones as
Mhm.
Musto and Bones
Mhm.
produced the hit "Dangerous" on the dance floor.
Yeah.
How did this partnership come about, and what was it like working together?
Okay. So Frankie and I started making records really during the freestyle era, the Latin freestyle stuff. We started doing that. And, I know how I met him. I met him through Lenny D. And just when I was going to school at Kingsborough and the broadcasting curriculum at the station, I was up there with Tommy Sozi. We were on air, and Lenny happened to call in. Young kid, he must have been, I don't know, 14, 15. I love what you guys are doing. I want to come up there. So he comes up there and we meet. He was friends with Frankie, and that's how I met Frankie. So I was making records with Lenny. We did a bunch of records, Lenny and I. Um, and then Frankie and I really hit it off, and we started making records and sample records and freestyle. Excuse me. We made some records with Omar Santana and stuff like that. Um, I was never really a big freestyle guy, but I appreciated it. Frankie loved it, so we did that, and from that, we started doing a whole bunch of fourth floor records, and then from those records, Tim Palmer in the UK, which was XL City Beat, um, he licensed "Just as Long as I Got You" from New Groove, and of course, that was all us anyway. And he wanted us to do an album, put an album together, which was really unheard of at that point because we were young producers making sample records, and we wound up putting together this album. And getting some singers, and Lee Genesis was on there, Stacey Paris, the PCP guys, which was Dangerous on the Dance Floor. They had this idea for "She's Dangerous on the Dance Floor," and they sang the rap, and I'm saying, "It's good, I like it, the lyrics are hysterical." I say, "It needs a hook." And one of the records from my childhood that my brothers introduced me to was Dangerous, Armed and Extremely Dangerous, by First Choice. So they were just, "She's dangerous on the dance floor, dangerous." So it just clicked with me like that. So that's how that happened, that hook. And Frankie had been going back and forth to England, DJing, and that's when I was doing major label remixes, and I didn't want to give that up. I didn't want to go back and forth on plane. My ex-wife was super jealous of me going back, and she was afraid of the ecstasy thing and all that. So I chose the route to do production and stay there and do that, which wound up really solidifying myself to be partners with Sylvia and all that, I guess. And Frankie chose to go back and forth. Well, he would come back with all the hottest records that were happening, and we'd go through them and sample them, and that's how kind of all the tracks came together. So uh, his ear to the street, my engineering prowess and classic knowledge and all that, it kind of fit together perfectly. So we kind of melded these things together. And I told you how the hook happened. I wound up meeting the PCP guys through a guy kid at the time, Lindell Richardson, um, who was a friend of mine, and I might have met him through um, um, God, Michael Baker, who was part of Total Science. Total Science was an early fourth floor record. They did as Total Science on another label, but I did some records with them. If I remember correctly, what the hell was the name of the record? God, you would think you'd know these records, but there's too many to remember. Um, so yeah, so I met Frankie, and that's how that happened. And at that time, I was using some musicians for remixes, my friend Mike Caro was bass player. He played on Michael Jackson for me, John Cicada, and a bunch of other stuff. And he came in, he wrote some songs. Stacey Paris was doing some freestyle stuff. She was actually going out with Frankie. She did "Time Is Running Out" on that album. So yeah, that's kind of how that transpired. And then how Frankie and I parted ways wasn't that we had a fight or anything. Frankie was really getting into more hardcore techno, and I already made Take Some Time Out, and I was like, yeah, I really want to stay in this genre. I really want to do more soulful kind of records. And so we basically went our own ways, and we still talk today. We just did a gig recently, a funhouse gig. The promoters hired us to do. I mean, the Funhouse really isn't the Funhouse without Jelly Bean. Everybody knows that, but they're still doing these parties because they own the name and the logo. It was a terrible night. It was pouring out. But me and Frankie were playing together. We had a lot of laughs and blah blah blah. But we're still friends, and he's still doing his thing, Frankie. Next question.
Define soulful house.
Soulful house to me, I would say, would hopefully be derived from an R&B foundation. Would be somewhat melodic and would be kind of developed arrangement wise. Not, I mean, it could be minimal with a good singer out with vocals on it. Obviously, there's a wide range of things that you can do, but for me, soulful house would be from the elements of soulful chord changes, and a soulful vocalist. You can even have an instrumental that's soulful house that doesn't have a vocalist. But I happen to enjoy, you know, thick, soulful chords and chord changes. That's how I would describe that. Right now, it could have an Afro twist, it could have many different tentacles to it, but I would have to say the embodiment of it and the foundation would be, lush keyboards and a vocalist.
As the co-owner and creative director of Northcott Productions, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced in running a record label and a studio?
That's a great question, and I touched on some of that before. Um, the biggest thing for me was doing things that I know would not help me reputationally and creatively, and do it for the almighty dollar. That to me would be the biggest challenge and internal fight that I would have with myself and Silvio Tancredi at the time, because he was all about the business and he cared about the music, but it was like, what's next? I have to build some records, I have to build some distributors. We got to do stuff. So it was constantly trying to find stuff. Now, I only had a few labels to deal with, which is still an issue, but all the other labels, that's really how it came about, distributing other labels. To grow this thing on one person's output, me, was daunting. So I said, I can't do this on my own. And that's how we started getting other labels. They dealt with their own A&R and stuff like that. And it just created a flow of records to come out. And it bolstered everyone. Everyone kind of fed off of that. I mean, Henry Street and Sulfuric, certainly the two that really catapulted what we were doing. There's no question. I mean, Sulfuric, them guys were just, and Brian always says, I was just copying what you were doing in the beginning, but him and Mark Pomeroy, they really, if they were listening to what I was doing, they took that shit to the next level and made some phenomenal records. Mark is a keyboard player, engineer, producer, Brian, of course, producer too, and a DJ, and those two guys working together, phenomenal. The biggest hit that they made for me was Track Source. Them having the just being producers in the music business and having the foresight to say, okay, everybody's down here, we're going 30,000 feet above, and we're going to see how are we going to capitalize on this. And they saw that shit coming. And Mark's a computer programmer. The websites is basically him. I'm sure he uses other programmers too, but I mean, that to me is just amazing. Now, it's the central place where everyone gets music. There are other things like Beatport and stuff like that, but they kind of specialize in other kinds of music. But the fact that they did that, they actually what wound up happening was as we were phasing out, they started doing pressing on their own, which in my later conversations with Brian said was the worst thing he could have ever did. It was a headache because it's not all it's clocked up to be. You know, distributors want to pay you in 90 days. The plant wants to get paid in 60 or 30, and you become the bank. So if you don't have money, so that's why this whole flow of records coming out, people like Nervous and Strictly had the mechanism for all that. And I guess the bank to do it. You know, we were borrowing money in some cases. And in the end, that was an issue for me. But that's really was the biggest thing. And just putting out records that I kind of like, you know, and all those are little notches in your reputation. Or if I remix something from a major label that absolutely sucked, but I was getting $20,000 to do it. I was using a number. I needed the money, you know, and I dump it into Northcott. It would help press other records. You know, it's crazy, you know. So that would probably be the biggest thing that I regret. But you know, it's water under the bridge at this point.
So you remixed big names like Michael Jackson, Celine Dion, Gloria Estefan. What was the most challenging and rewarding aspect of working with such high-profile artists?
So the tough thing was competing for those mixes because all the A&R people were plugged into all the same people. Like if there was a record that came out, they would look, okay, who's got a hot underground record out?
Oh.
That was a big thing. So having your name out there and happening really helped feed that. And also if you were a popular DJ. So the obvious ones, Masters at Work, David Morales, I mean, they were always first in line, and rightfully so. You had the Danny Tenaglia. I mean, I can't think off top. Frankie Knuckles, of course. They were always first in line, so I always knew that I was going to get crumbs in that area. It just so happened that I had nice relationships with some people. So his name was Frank Serrallo. He worked for Epic, and he was good friends with Larry Flick, and I was friends with Larry Flick, and I had met them all when I was being managed by this woman, Duffy Macri, who used to manage Shep Pettibone with another partner of hers, but it's a long story. And I met all these influential people, and it was great, and I felt like I kind of made it in a sense that I was in this circle that I would have never been in. So he wound up, you know, taking a chance on me and giving me Michael Jackson, Gloria Estefan, and stuff like that. The records were challenging, and if I was in the position of, let's say, Masters at Work or David, I'm sure they turned stuff down, even if it was a major artist, because lots of records that they wanted to remix were impossible to make dance records, excuse me, in the genre that we needed. And that's how all these dubs came about of just using a clip of the vocal and making a whole new track, you know, and there was a lot of that. So especially for a lot of the Gloria Estefan records, you know, especially like Mi Tierra, it was all in Spanish. Rhythmically, to get to 4/4, you just can't. Not like today, you load it into Logic, and even though that would not even happen for that record, but today you can literally load stuff in, it times it out perfectly. You don't have to do nothing. Back in that day, we were flying stuff in, putting it on multi-track. I mean, it was crazy what you had to do back then. It was a lot of work just to get it to the point where you can start producing on top of it. Meaning, you make a simple drum beat, get the vocals in time, lots of times a guy like that, like David or Masters at Work, that had Dave Darlington to do that. I forget David's engineer. There's some, well, Eric Couple played keyboards for him a lot too, obviously, and others, Peter Schwartz. But he had guys doing all that for them before they even got to the studio. But guess who the guy was? So I wound up doing all that myself. And back in the day, to get a record that's 106 in time, or 102, to at least the tempo that you can make a dance record out of it, was very difficult. So you would use something they called time compression. And there was a piece of equipment from Lexicon. I think it was Lexicon 300, if I'm not mistaken. And you would run it through it, and it would compress it, meaning that it would take information and shrink it down so that it was wound up being faster. So that's time expansion would be if it was the other way around. If you wanted to make something faster that was slower. I don't know if I'm mixing that up. In any event, it was a laborious process. Like Michael Jackson, I happened to do In the Closet, and when I heard the record, I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's Michael Jackson. I have to do it. And it was like so slow. I think Teddy Riley may have produced that. There was that album, that particular cut. It was really slow. It was really slow, and it was really funk R&B-ish. And not even from a keyboard standpoint, just from groove, almost like Cameo. So to make that what I made it into, and I actually played all the keyboards on that record. At the time, I remember I had an argument with Peter Dow, and he wanted to play on it, and I said no, and I wound up doing it myself. I'm glad I did it, but of course, I'm not a professional keyboard player, but I can bang some stuff out. And that was very gratifying that I did all of that myself. I didn't wind up being the mix engineer, but it was very difficult. Those records were very difficult to mix. And, so it was very gratifying when it became successful. It was on the radio. It was Michael Jackson, for God's sakes. But there were others that I did, Olivia Newton-John. I can't even remember half. Everybody always says Michael Jackson, Gloria Estefan, John Cicada, but there were many, many others that I'm very proud of, that weren't of that stature. But definitely the work that had to be put in to make those records dance records was really tough. It was very, very tough. I remember like Hurley, who did Remember the Time, which was phenomenal. And Hurley, that guy, he is the man. I mean, he really, and people appreciate him and hold him up there, but he came from, made some great underground records, and then he started producing, CC Peniston and a few other artists off the top of my head I can't remember, and then the remixes he did. I mean, there was continuity in his sound the whole way through, for those records, but he really maximized on everything from that, and I guess you can't talk about him enough.
Let's talk about your creative process. Walk us through your typical process when creating a remix or producing a track.
So, producing a track right now, like a non-artist track, like just making a track, I've been finding difficult for myself, whereas back in the day, I wouldn't be so critical. I'm very critical of myself now. So if I want to just make a groove and, vocal sample over it, back in the day, it was like no big deal. But now I'm very critical and maybe know too much that it's very tough for me. Like right now, I'm doing a remix for Tough Jam. Tough Jam is a UK speed garage. I hate that word, speed garage. UK garage. Very successful guys, very great guys, and we did some stuff together in the '90s. But they asked me to do a mix of something for them, and it's just a vocal sample. So I'm creating a track under it, and I'm like, "Do you want me to kind of be more like what you do with my twist?" Or and they said, "No, you just do what you do. We like what you do," which was great because it made it a little easier for me. But something like that is a little tougher for me these days. Um, Whereas if I have a full vocal, my most favorite thing to do is having the vocal, just creating a crude drum track and figure out where I'm gonna make the arrangement go, figure out chord changes. That to me is I can do that all day. I love it. Now, if I was a better keyboard player, it'd probably be easier, but I have an ear and I'm taught myself enough where I can get through it. Obviously, I've made all these records, but I love having a vocal and playing different chords underneath it and figuring out where I want it to go because that's really the foundation of, where you're gonna go with it in the end. It really sets the stage of what's happening. You may use the chords, take them out and have it more bass oriented or whatever, but that to me is probably the most enjoyable part. And then after I do that, and I kind of feel like where I'm going, then I'll do drums. I'll embellish the drums around the foundation of the vocal and some crude chord arrangement that I have. Then after I do the drums and I feel like, okay, this is good. This is a good foundation. I'm going to embellish it from here, but I'm going to go back to the keyboard arrangement. And then I'll start, embellishing on the keyboards, adding different elements and stuff like that. And then once I have a basis of the track, I'll kind of get my arrangement in order. How long the intro is going to be, how much space there's going to be in between each verse. Am I going to extend the chorus the second time it happens? How much of a break there's going to be? What the outro is going to be like? Then after I get that, then I start tightening up sounds, really today, it's not like back in the day where, you know, you're not in mixing mode until you're in mixing mode. A lot of times you wind up doing things as you're going. You wind up tweaking sounds and stuff like that as you're going versus back in the day, you'd be like in the B room of the studio and it had sufficient stuff to do it, but you were just concentrating on getting everything down on tape and obviously then digital at the later part of it, and then worry about what the kick sounds like against the snare and stuff like that. Today, you're working in the box, as they say, which is everything in the computer. I don't have a lot of keyboards outside of my setup, so I'm basically working in the box. Um, it would have been different if I stayed in the business and I sold all my gear. I sold all my gear. I had an Atari multi-track, 24 track. I had a bunch of outboard gear. Um, I changed careers and I didn't really have the space for it. And like I said, I was a little bitter. I'm so fucking pissed off at myself that I did it. But, here we are. And thankfully, you're able to do stuff today in the box. They have all these great plugins and instruments. And to be quite honest, it'd be hard pressed for people to really tell the difference, but it does for sure change the creative process. Being able to sit at a keyboard and tweak the sounds and stuff like that, even though you could do it on the computer, there's just something about the analog sense of the computers of the keyboards that I liked. Um, so after I have all that together and I have, and you're constantly updating, the vocal sounds a little out of time here, I'll shift that, maybe I should take the bass out here or, you know, I need to add something here to embellish the vocal or drop stuff out. And you're doing that all along. And then once you kind of finalize with the way the arrangement is, you should have been working on the sound of it throughout the time. But for me, back in the day, I'd be like, okay, I worked 2 nights on this. I'm out of it. Right now, because of my life, I have my business that I run. I only have a few hours every night, so it takes me longer. And I also have to be in the mood. You can't just say, "Oh, I have to do this tonight." And thankfully, I have the luxury to say, "You know what? I'm just not in the head. I don't want to do it." You know. So for me, in that few hours every night and on the weekends, but I have things I want to do. I have a wife. I want to go on vacation or whatever it might be. But most of the time, I have a few hours each day, and some days I'm learning a piece of software, or I'm going through track source and emails of records for my record collection, so that when I DJ, I know what the hell's going on, So, or I'm answering emails about other music stuff. Like, even though most of my catalog is sold, I do own other stuff that does get licensed, and I'm dealing with that.
I also had no idea the lack of stability in the music industry, right? From the outside looking in, it was all like Club Vinyl, Louis Vega, Eve of Souls. It was
Yeah.
Bob Tucker. It was Masters of Work, seeing them in London. It
Mhm.
was going to Ibiza, and it was the rise of Speed Garage, Tough Jam. Like
Mhm.
I had no idea what was behind the curtain and the stress behind the
Yeah.
curtain. I just heard of like the crazy remixing fees and the crazy DJ gigs and the New Year's Eve gigs, but I didn't realize the other side of it.
Yeah. And you have to give them props for doing their job to making the perception what it was,
Yes.
to lure you in, which is the case with young producers who want to do it even today. And, for a young guy that wants to make records, I mean, the entry is the barrier is much lower, but the success barrier has gotten so much higher because now you're one of a zillion. As soon as as great as technology was for the business and for guys like me, like if it wasn't for technology, I would have never gone. I'm not a musician, right? I didn't have a reputation as a producer where major labels were going to hire me to produce albums. So it was all self-made, all of us. You know, Today the technology is much better and even easier to make records, but the music has lost stature. And that's the scary part of it all. Like I said, there's so many talented people, and I can get so excited listening to someone else's record that this shit is fucking dope. I wish I would have did it, or I want to approach something that I do like that, or you kind of get from that, and then you see something that doesn't happen to it. It's like, it's mind-boggling. Definitely mind-boggling.
This has been a fantastic interview. We need to do a part two because we haven't even talked about the club scene
Yeah.
and the nightlife scene.
Mhm.
So I want to end this one, part one, and we'll schedule part two
Okay.
with advice. What advice would you give the 19-year-old next generation Tommy Musto who wants to follow in your footsteps?
Whew,
Don't do it,
okay.
or get a day job, or like what would you say to
I
them?
would say, at 19 years old, you don't have a family, most likely, meaning kids and a wife and a house and bills, and we know how all that shit goes, and feeding yourself. That's a different story. So you get roped into all this, and it's fun and it's alluring. But once reality comes in, I made a decision for myself. I like having a house. I like having children. I need money to raise them and to do this shit. It's not easy. You can't live your life like this. You need to have some kind of stability. And the music business was tough. And having Northcott helped me have some stability because the draw from the company wasn't based on just what I was doing, thank God, you know? But what I would say is, honestly, what I would say is that please develop a plan B and have them running together, right? Have them running together. Um, and it makes it tough, but definitely have them running together because you will regret if you don't. Um, and if you're gonna make records, unless you got this shit all down, whether you're a great keyboard player, you have a great singer and all that, you still need a great song. All of the stuff that we do is good in our genre, but let's face it, there's been no breakout hit song that has gone to the next level, and the song is everything. Now, like with hip hop, oh, you're a sellout. You know, if they when I don't know if you even remember in the '90s, like when hip hop records used to have hooks that kind of went pop. I can't think of anything off the top of my head to give you an example, but they would call that a sellout. If a house music guy makes a record that's a little too pop, underground forgets about it. There's nothing to get it to the next level, and it falls by the wayside. So it's it's kind of a catch 22. But songs are everything in every genre, no matter what, and the hook. Nothing will stop that. So a track will get you someplace and make some people bounce, but you know. So if I had to say what would be something that would leapfrog you to the head of the pack, it's a little underhanded, but they're not watching, they're not protecting their copyright. Take a damn not pop record, take a damn hit record and make a new track out of it, put it on Bandcamp or whatever you I think that is the vehicle to, you know, get you in the eye of all the DJs, and then once that gets to that level, someone who could really take it to the next level will wind up, you know, licensing what needs to be licensed and clearing everything, and if they let you do that. But to me, if you want to get to the next level quickly, you need something like that. You know, I mean, it's if someone was a great songwriter, right? They wouldn't say, "Oh, I want to be I want to be in house music and write great songs," because let's face it, they ain't checking. The powers to be ain't checking. So a good songwriter is not gonna waste his talent, and I hate to call it waste because I love house music. Um, you know, for a song and something like that. If it's already a hit, and then you know, I don't know, Mariah Carey writes a song, David Morales remixes it. That's great, but it was a pop record before that. So if someone wants to really get to the next level, it would be do something outlandish like that. Take something that's scandalous that'll get people's attention. And the second thing I would say is do something completely different than what everybody else is doing. It may not get you anywhere, but I mean, to really stand out, this stuff is like it's so everybody's doing the same thing. Even though it's slightly different, a lot of it sounds the same. And you know, it's very easy for me. Like once a week, I'll go through the track source to make sure I got everything that's new that I like, and I can click through that bitch quick. I know right away. Nah, no, no, no. This is interesting. Let me put it in the cart. And I don't buy it right away. I wait a day or two and I go back and I say, I was a little amped when I listened to it. I don't know if I like it, you know? Um, so yeah, I would say either do something scandalous with already a popular record, um, or you know, just be different because otherwise you're just falling into the same trap as everybody else, you know? That would be my advice. That's my 2 cents. I don't know.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Back after like 25 years, man. I appreciate you.
It's longer than that, and I appreciate you too.
Have a good one.
All right, take care, man. Bye-bye.
Bye.